Hello, welcome.
Hi.
Hi, everyone, welcome. Hi. I'm Bailey Mizell, and I'm here with Regina Mamou.
Hi.
We'll just wait a few more minutes here for others to make it in. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, really looking forward to the talk today.
Me too. I know you and I have been kind of geeking out about it.
I know, exactly. Exactly.
Yes. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, Jeannie. Hi, Joanne. Hi, Margie. Hi, Paula. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bailey Mizell. I'm here with Regina Mamou. We're just waiting a few more minutes to let everyone get in. Hi. Feel free to talk amongst yourself via the chat.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Hi, Alex Maddock, if you're out there. a former colleague of mine from the Art Institute of Chicago. So got to give a shout out to her.
Right. Always. Hi, everyone. Just another minute or so before we get started, just letting others make it in. Happy Friday.
Oh no, it's Friday the 13th.
Whoa.
Okay. It's all good vibes here, though. I feel like this is a really good way of, really grounding your center for this March 13th. Or excuse me, this Friday the 13th, March 13th.
Yeah.
Friday the 13th. I feel like this is a really good, it's all good vibes today. And we're learning, and that's important.
And it's been a long week, so this is a good way to really settle that in.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Another minute or so. Just let others get in. I'm Bailey Mizell. We're here today with Regina Mamou.
Hi.
I know I just keep saying the same thing.
No, it's all good.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Feel free to talk amongst yourself via the chat. We're about to get started here in a few seconds. Straight hairs. Okay. So, hello, everyone. I'm Bailey Mizell, the director of PAC LA. We're here today with Regina Mamou.
Hi.
Regina will be discussing the exhibition Taking Stock of Power, and Other View of the Berlin Wall, a project realized by Arwed Messmer and Annett Gröschner that opened at the Walther Collection Project Space in New York City in 2019. Also, shout out, this will be Regina's second lecture with us. You might have been with us for her last talk. That was Surveying the Career and Image-Based Techniques of Gerhard Richter. So we're happy to welcome her here again today.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Just a brief little blurb about PAC. We're the Photographic Arts Council of Los Angeles. Our work at PAC is inspired by an inclusive and involving conversation, inviting people to be engaged and inspired by photography and photo-based arts. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to our membership base for their ongoing support and love for the photographic arts, making PAC what it is today. And I also want to give a shout out to Art Muse Los Angeles and Claire Cunney for coordinating this lecture with us today. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Claire.
And one more quick shout out. On the screen here, you'll see our landing. To sign up for our newsletter, you can visit our website, and also for our social media, here's our Instagram at the bottom. For any of our past talks, recordings of our past talks, you can visit our YouTube channel or our Vimeo channel, which is just Photographic Arts Council Los Angeles. Just for a quick run of show, Regina's lecture will run for about 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll have space at the end, about 15 minutes for a Q&A following the presentation. During the lecture, please feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Don't worry about flooding it. I'm able to tack everyone's questions down and we'll get to them as we can. But again, feel free to do that in the chat and in the Q&A box. And just a quick bio on Regina Mamou. Regina is an artist, collaborator, and arts educator. She's been presenting and discussing art since 2006 and has been a lecturer with Art Muse Los Angeles for the past 6 years. Mamou holds an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design, and received a Fulbright Fellowship to Jordan. She is currently the first artist in residence at the Windy Museum of the Cold War in Los Angeles, California. And just before I give it to Regina, I just want to say again, I'll come back at the end for the Q&A to moderate that, and please just add your questions in the Q&A box. And Regina, take it from here.
Thank you so much, Bailey. I really appreciate this opportunity too to come back and lecture for PAC. It's been really interesting, and I love the topics that I am allowed to explore and share with you guys. So
Yes.
with that, I shall go ahead and share my screen. So here we go. Okay. And now we'll just enter slideshow. Okay, so I just want to make sure that everybody, that at least Bailey on your end, that it looks okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yes, so again, welcome everybody to the exhibition Taking Stock of Power and Other View of the Berlin Wall. So we will be going through the exhibition briefly, but we will then also be talking about the book, which was a massive component alongside the exhibition for this 25-year intense project between Arwed Messmer and Annett Gröschner. So before we begin, I just wanted to go through a few of the key wall dates, especially from the early period, which is where we'll really be centering the conversation. So so as you can see, August 12th, the night of the 12th, 13th, the wall went up in the middle of the night with barbed wire, and they were using a lot of, East Germany were using a lot of like intimidation tactics at the border to scare people off. The 20th of September in 1961, they started a first generation wall, which was essentially just a wall in the inner city, part of Berlin. Then there was the incorporation of the Hinterland Wall, which is the wall before the wall, and the Death Strip, which is rather infamous in its name, meaning just the no person's land between the two walls. And then we have the third generation, which is really important to this talk because it's essentially the wall that it was replaced with precast elements and concrete. And so essentially for this exhibition, the images that Arwed Messmer and Annett Gröschner, and we'll talk about this a lot more in detail, but they essentially received this kind of documentation, internal documentation, to essentially photograph the wall in its entirety as a way to prepare for structural renovations and to provide examples for engineers. And then we have the fourth generation wall, which is what we would consider to be the most well-known wall, the very smooth concrete wall that is considered border wall 75. And then in 1988 and 1989, there were many options that had been discussed in terms of turning the wall into a high-tech surveillance state, which was never built. And also there were massive just costs associated with it. And then the last one was to start to adopt hedges to the wall in the outskirts of Berlin as a way to make the wall more green or natural. So it's important that I go over that just so we have an understanding of how to better interpret the photographs that we're seeing. So now I'm briefly going to talk about the exhibition before I get into the book, as I talked about. So the exhibition, as Bailey mentioned, opened in December of 2019, which marked the 2019 marks the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was very appropriate to the opening of their exhibition. It was supposed to close in March. I'm not sure what the status is now given COVID, but I hope that at some point we'd be able to see this exhibition either at this venue or another venue. So when you enter the exhibition, and just to be clear, this exhibition was also shown in 2016 at a municipal gallery in Berlin, but this is a further iteration of this in 2019, 2020. So the way that the exhibition is organized is by showcasing several of a number of the panoramas, which we'll again talk about, so don't worry too much about that quite yet, but showcasing the panoramas and all the other categories that encompass the projects, such as the portraits and film starts, and also escape tunnels and escape attempts, and also typologies, things that were separated from their original use and brought into these grids of ladders, for example, or watchtowers. The one thing I should say, though, is actually I want to back up for a second. The one thing I should say is that because there were so many panoramas, there were over 1,000 in total, which are in the entirety in the book that I'll be talking about. But the way that the gallery was organized was with the panoramas not necessarily just on the wall, but being in its entirety in these 12 folios, what were these sort of portfolio books that would open flat so that you could begin to see the reconstructed panoramas in their entirety. So essentially, the idea was to create an exhibition that was more of like a reading room that you would access if you were going into a state archive, like the German Federal Archives, for example. So now I want to get into the book. And again, the book is not really considered from my perspective, it's not necessarily considered a separate project. The two are one in the same. And I think that the exhibition definitely adds another layer. And the book is just a further deep dive into the conversations around what the early wall meant and looked like. So before we get started, I'm going to show you a very short clip of the Taking Stock of Power book, as someone's leafing through it very quickly. So here we go, just so you have an understanding of what exactly I'm talking about. So just to give you a sense too, I think what visually was expected by looking at this particular book and just how it's laid out, again, is just like leafing through an archive. The categories that were separated, because it's quite a tome, it's in encyclopedic size books divided into 2 volumes. So I'm going to go through each category that's in the book that was also included in the exhibition, but I'm actually going to start with panoramas, which is actually volume 2 in the book, but obviously I feel the most important to get to in the beginning of this conversation. So as I mentioned, the panoramas were by conscripted border regiments that were commissioned to essentially take photos of the entirety of the wall in 1965 and 1966 as a way to document the infrastructure that needed to be updated or fortified so that the East German military could pass this on to structural engineers and engineers in general to fortify the wall. So essentially what happened was in 1995, Annett Gröschner and Arwed Messmer were in the intermediate military archives exploring some information about Glimastrasse, which was a street in Berlin that had been divided between East and West. And essentially, Annett was saying she comes from a writing background, a writing theater background, whereas Arwed comes from a photographic background. And the two of them were looking, and they basically said, you know, when you access something from the archives, oftentimes you don't really know what you're going to get. And so upon getting this delivery of this box, they noticed that there were rolls and rolls of developed film that had never been, that was just still in its negative format. It had never been transferred to images, and it looked as almost as it had been discarded. And upon realizing this, they began to understand that they had quite a treasure trove in terms of having images that were taken from the east side, East Germany, looking toward the west, which is an incredibly unusual point of view, considering that it was strictly forbidden for East Germans to get close to the wall, let alone take a photo. In fact, there's even some stories saying that it was even as much as waving at the wall was considered inappropriate. In addition to this, they then went further into the archives. I believe it was in 2012. And they continued to look more and more for wall images, and they stumbled upon thousands of I think it was about 3,000 single images of the Berlin Wall that were, no negatives survived. It was just the photos in itself. And what Arwed decided that he wanted to do was to actually take these photographs, match them up, and then create what is called a panoramic stitching in digital photography. So you can see at the top here, these are 4 images that they would have seen in the archive, and at the bottom is how it was constructed into a panorama in the book. So because, as I mentioned, Annett Gröschner comes from a writing background and a conceptual writing and textual background, whereas Arwed, again, is in photography. So he was really tasked with this idea of reconstructing these images that were never meant to be seen in a panoramic view other than single photographs. But they decided upon conceptual reconsideration that they felt that it was important to actually see it as an unbroken view as opposed to single images. In addition, Annett went further into the archives to find actual material that so many records were being kept at the time from the East German side, notations, passing conversations. And in the early days of the wall, oftentimes West Berliners would shout things over the wall that the border guards would take note of. So for example, here on the top panorama, you hear someone say, "A man appears with a homemade poster, the People's Chamber deputies, former National Socialists." So this is one of the documentations on, they're referring to the West Berlin street, and at this particular time on this West Berlin street as it's heard on the eastern side, which is again very highly unusual because we are not used to receiving information about it coming from the eastern side. This bottom one, for example, too, is 3 building workers throw a tin lid at the sentry post, which is the watchtower post. So there's lots of these interactions with people that ranged from to very, very heartfelt and really speaking towards the difficulties of a fissured space at the time, to things that are kind of funny in a way. Like, for example, in this top panorama, a man screams out, "Shoot that dog over there, I can't sleep," to one of the German guards. And actually, we'll get to this a little bit later on in the presentation, but dogs were actually a major part of creating this early border, which continued until 1989. So, and again, you can see some of the other sort of familial relations that had kind of separated with this division of the city, where all of a sudden in the middle, literally overnight from August 12th to 13th of 1961, if you worked in the West, you no longer were working in the West. If you had family in the West, you were no longer seeing that family, you were no longer visiting cemeteries, and vice versa. So it was a really almost like a scarification in the landscape of Germany. So now I also wanted to show you again what you would see flipping through the book of volume 2. So it's just pages and pages and pages of this unbroken wall showing both the inner city of Berlin and all the way around the entire perimeter of West Berlin. So you can see even on the outskirts how it tends to get a little bit raggedy at times. You know, it's still, again, in its infancy, so they're using barbed wire and anything that's really available. For example, if you lived at a house that was on the border between East and West Berlin, and you were on the eastern side, chances are you were evacuated and all those walls were bricked up. So you had no access to escape from that building window, for example. So things of that nature, buildings were being vacated, and even cemeteries were used as this part of the early wall fortification. The other thing that I find really interesting about this book, so I should say again, just to reiterate, and apologies for making several reiterations, but I think it's really important with all the information that's is being discussed within this project. So one of the great things about what Annett and Arwed have done is to really organize these panoramas into understanding where the wall was located in the city of Berlin and on the outskirts, and also drawing direct notations to particular sites on these maps, which start a chapter, and then corresponding them to specific panoramas. So for example, panorama 60 would be located at the bottom here, where it reads panorama 60. So you're directly able to see this on the wall itself, and then even further in the left-hand, the lower left-hand corner, you can see where that corresponds to the wall in general. So there's a lot of information from that perspective. One of the most fascinating parts of this, which I find the most interesting, is that they also decided to include the geodata, or longitude, latitude lines that are actually you can do through Google Maps. And so I did decide to do that in fact, for panorama 60. So I used the coordinates, I slotted it into Google Maps, and just to be further sure that what I was in fact seeing was actually what's depicted on the map is in fact, so here we go. If you look at the 2 stars, we know that this is this particular lake, and it's identified in the same place. And now this pin drop on Google Maps is the former site of this section of wall 60. So you're able to really correspond something that took place in the 60s, and translate that to what it looks like in contemporary Germany or in contemporary Berlin, which I find very fascinating. So they've done this with all of the panoramas. So in addition to that, they've supplemented, so the panoramas are really the meat of the project, but they've really separated this and created more categories as a way to fortify the conversation about what the wall really meant, that it wasn't just the physical wall, but there were so many other aspects that went along with trying to essentially create this this wall to keep in their own people, the people of the East German state. So in addition to finding the panoramas as part of the archive, they also were these telephoto pictures were also part of the book and as part of the archive. So they decided to include those in the beginning parts of the chapters. And I've always noted at the bottom which volume it is and which pages they can be found. But essentially, these, again, are East Germans looking out into West Berlin. It's a little bit hard to see on the left-hand side, but you actually see this man photographing from the western side toward the east as the East Germans are photographing this couple. And it's a bit hard to see here, but this is actually fencing that the camera is being pointed through, which is kind of blurry and out of focus. And this really, I think this is one of the opening pages of the book, volume 1. And I think this really speaks to the kind of conversations that are being had which are the curiosity from the West German side and the ability for them to see and depict the wall. But from an East German side, always there was this secrecy surrounding it. The other thing that I wanted to point out that is very important into understanding the context is to really take note of the fact that what Annett and Arwed did was to find a number of files that had been declassified but had never really been interrogated or investigated. And so by bringing these to light, they also digitized this as part of the German Federal Archives, and now they're actually accessible by their archival number if you were to go into the German Federal Archives website, which you can do. And so, for example, on the right-hand side here, you see these numbers, BArch, DVH 60, so on and so forth. It's now actually referred to DVH 58. Sorry, that's very, very particular, but just in case you're interested. And if you were to go into the website and search for this signature DVH 58, so on and so forth, you'd be able to find those specific photographs and see them in context with other photographs from this particular archive that is being digitized. So it's just something fascinating to think about if you do desire to further research into this particular archive, that you do have accessibility through the German Federal Archives. So in addition to, we have the telephotos, in addition to the panoramas, they also, Annett and Arwed also decided to include what they refer to as film starts. So if you think about it, it's just literally what it is. Essentially, when a roll of film was put into the camera, you always have to take that one picture to wind the film to its starting place with 35mm. And so often what you'd get are these kinds of throwaway pictures, or what was referred to as throwaway pictures. And so what you get in a sense is a kind of being able to see the wall, but also East Germany, almost in the point of you putting the film into the camera and taking the picture. It has a much more sort of personal point of view that is very different from some of the more colder, removed, kind of banal images of the panoramas. So this provides just a little bit of more information into understanding who was taking these pictures. Obviously, conscripted soldiers, as I mentioned, but also, you see a smiling soldier on the left-hand side, for example. So these are there's still a human quality to these images. And because the archives required scanning every single negative, including the film starts, into the archive, that these are actually part of the German Federal Archives as well, because they are part of the film. The next section that Annett and Arwed decided to include were the escape tunnels and escape routes. And these were taken both from border troops from the German Federal Archive, but also from the Stasi's archives. As you can imagine, the Stasi, or the German secret police, were very much interested in how people escaped and who had made successful escape attempts and for what reason. So here we have a number of pictures within the book, but also organized in a gridded system in the exhibition. But you see these various methods and ways that people attempted to circumvent the wall through digging, or other sources, such as, tons of different electrical wires and batteries and pots and pans and things that they might have used in the escape elements, ended up being these kinds of documents, again, these kind of banal, formal for government purposes, documents of the things that were found when people made their successful escapes and then had to leave those things behind. So in the early years, there were still a lot of kind of experimentation with what you could get away with, in terms of like the various tactics that people took to either, as I mentioned, maybe escape out of a building that was on the border, but their walls hadn't been bricked up, for example, or trying to swim across the river, for example. So all of these little escape attempts and their accessories involved with that are shot in this very sort of crude, almost what we consider this crude documentary format, because that's in fact what they were. None of the people taking the pictures were professionals. So in addition to that, because Annett Gröschner is, as I mentioned, an author and also works in conceptual textual information, one of the things that she was really interested in was going through these archives and also looking at different arrest reports, and to essentially democratize that. And what I mean to say is, because so many of these images, as we saw in the beginning at the Walther Collection Exhibition Space, everything was very gridded and organized in a very systematic way. And so she actually extracted from various files, she extracted information from these arrest reports from the border guards, and then compiled it in what she referred to as kind of like an idiom or a kind of dialogue that might be easier to read and identify with. And for these purposes, you start to see a kind of humanization of the wall that you haven't seen quite yet. And I think these particular stories form a much more holistic understanding of not just the kind of militaristic might that took place, but also what that meant to the East German citizens and how that affected them in various ways. For example, I was reading some of these notes, and one that stuck out for me was where they wrote, "A man he knew came into the flat. The two men fought and threw an ink pot over the man's clothing. Then he went into the border area because he hoped the guards could help him." So there's these kinds of funny exchanges, but also deeply troubling, and really speak to the kinds of uncertainty that were taking place at the time when arrests and when escape attempts were really starting to be halted by the fortification of the wall. So now we're looking into ladders. So again, like the other typologies of the escape attempts and the escape attempts and tunnels, as well as the panoramas, and as we'll see with further documentations, the ladders is another way of removing these kinds of typologies from their original kind of description and placing them in the book through pages upon pages of these seemingly endless images of what looks to be very plain ladders. But in fact, these are escape ladders that were either left behind because the escape was successful, or the escape was intercepted and there was documentation of where these escape attempts were taking place. And so that provided, again, further information to help the military really decide on where to fortify the wall. Because again, just to reiterate, the wall that we think of when we think of the Berlin Wall is Wall 75. It's the smooth concrete function. It has this very monumental scale, endless scale. But at the time, as you can see, even in the top photograph here, the top left photograph, you can see that this is just really a hodgepodge or mishmash of barbed wire and bricked fencing and maybe some concrete elements, but there's really not a lot of uniformity to it. And I think this is what, over time, Walter Ulbricht, who was in charge of East Germany at the time, had actually had a meeting with Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, I believe it was in 1961, where he had asked Khrushchev, I would like a wall. And Khrushchev said, barbed wire will just do fine for you. And eventually the barbed wire was not succeeding in keeping people out. And the other thing is, barbed wire, considering this is just less than 20 years or around 20 years after World War II, as you can imagine, barbed wire in Germany took on a very coded sense of referencing Nazi Germany. So there was a lot of insistence on wanting to go move away from barbed wire as a way to take the associations not to, oh, we're imprisoning our people into East Germany, but in fact, we're doing the opposite. What they like to turn it around and say was to say, this wall is not to keep our people in. This wall is to protect our people. This is an anti-imperialist wall. And so we have to do this because the Allied forces also occupied part of Berlin on the western side, which are obviously the US, the British, and France. So they felt that because the Soviet Union was in charge of the GDR of East Germany, they had to really protect themselves from the other allies, the Westerners. And so this is a way of how they kind of justified the fortification of the wall, moving more into the concrete structure. And as I'm saying, just to reiterate more and more, I know it might be a little bit, a lot, but I just want to continue to press again that the images were taken so that this wall of 1965 and 66 could continue to move out of the state of just simply barbed wire. And so you can see again some of the other documentations of where the wall kind of failed, or where escape attempts happened because of where the ladders were put in place. So I'm just going to go through this very briefly, but the other thing that another kind of section or theme that was added into the books and also is present in the exhibition are these is information provided about the watchdogs or the guard dogs. So the guard dogs actually formed a very large part of protecting the wall, and like the border regiments and the wall and the death strip and all of these other elements and the watchtowers, all of these elements were just further there to reinforce the boundary line, or the point of that you were not allowed to cross. And these dogs, as you can see on the left-hand side here, were oftentimes chained to these lead lines, and they'd run along these lead lines on a leash over and over and over again. And you can imagine too, a lot of people in East Germany complained about these dog lines because they were so noisy. You'd hear it again and again because there was such a small amount of space that one dog might be running. They were also not cared for very well. As you can see in this image on the right-hand side that also came from the book, a lot of these dogs actually would choke from their own being caught in their own chains, or they were so poorly cared for that you know, they were kind of like the rejects of dogs, for example, that might have been for pets or for show purposes, but they were kind of like the dogs that had enough issues that they were kind of placed into the watchdog status, so a lower kind of status. And so what Annett does was she went through these kinds of documents, and at one point the border regiment had been tasked with, I believe it was, as it says on the bottom title slide, the 31st, 33rd, 35th, 37th, and 38th Border Regiment. So they were all tasked with documenting the dogs in those regiments, which were about 350. And as you go through pages upon pages of this in the book, you also can pull out differences. Even though there's a lot of systemization, you can pull out differences from these particular dogs where you can see they're actually not in great condition. Some of them here you see kind of close up of some of the tags that the watchdogs received, but a lot of them were in very, very poor health and were not taken care of at all. And they were just sort of discarded and replaced. Like one can imagine a lot of things in the East German state. Now we're going to get into towers and dugouts, which I feel like is a very interesting and important inventory to look into, because of the association too with the Bernard and Hilla Bescher, who I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know, who were leading conceptual photographers in Germany during the 60s and 70s, and really inspired a whole school of photographers, like Candida Hofer and Thomas Ruth, for example. But all that is to say is that when Annett and Arwed were constructing these kinds of pulling out images from their original meaning. So for example, you can see on the left-hand side that these towers and dugouts originally came from these descriptions. By removing them from these descriptions, they were able to catalog almost about 200 different watchtowers and dugouts that surrounded the space of the border. And so again, they really do acknowledge that the Beschers and their kind of industrial, their industrial typologies really, it's interesting that there's a lot of correlation, but you can definitely see upon closer look that if you look, for example, on the Beschers image on the right-hand side, and then you're going to say the typologies that are basically constructed in the book for taking stock of power, while they look very similar, they were shot by all different types of lay photographers, people that did not nearly have the technical know-how that the Beschers had. And so they're shot from different angles, different sites, different times of day. So there's a typology in a very loose sense, only in terms of thinking about it as a literal documentation for trying to fortify and reinforce structures. So we have some of the watchtowers. I think at the end in 1989, there were something like 300 watchtowers along the border. And in some of the more remote parts outside of the inner city, the wall would even make use of sheds and various dugouts covered with branches and pine needles and things of that nature to further to create a kind of makeshift dugout for East German soldiers to take up positions. And they were constantly watching West Berliners on the other side as well, which provided further fodder, as I had mentioned in the beginning, for Annett Gröschner to start to look at the archives and see what types of interactions took place from a textual perspective and how that got recorded and reported by the East German side. So now we're going to enter into portraits, which I find very interesting as a portion of both the exhibition and book. So upon further researching these archives, they came across also images of soldiers that had actually been taken from these, what they called commendation certificates or letters. So in it, you could see information about each border guard and their picture, as well as the things that they did right, the things that, various circumstances that allowed them to receive praise for their particular actions. Because they needed to maintain the anonymity of these soldiers, they of course had to, they decided not on putting a black bar over their face because it felt too much like they were becoming perpetrators. And instead they chose to use these kinds of gray bars. Go back to that. They decided upon using these gray bars as a way to blur their identity. But one of the things that's very interesting is, even though you have a very standard, almost monotonous typology of what a German border guard looks like, you can still see a number of differences upon the pins that they're wearing, the different medals, etc., the way they hold themselves and pose themselves. But you also begin to realize how young these soldiers are. Military conscription was for 542 days at the time. And what they found was it was actually better to bring in soldiers from I guess what they called the kind of peasant class, or much more of a rural farm class, people that were not part of that had not been part of Berlin at all, or did not have understanding of the inner city of Berlin. And the reason to do that was to separate the people that might have inside information, or might have a comrade on the other side in West Germany that they perhaps could conspire to escape. So they decided upon people that had never really been to the city and really just were tasked to be put in front of this border as a kind of conscripted service, but also that they were constantly rotating the position because they never wanted border guards to become chummy with each other. Because once you become chummy with a border guard and you have your service with them together for a long period of time, you start to share ideas and information. And maybe, as an East German state would say, you begin to come up with ideas beyond, you know, more sort of like free thinking ideas that might influence your being able to represent your state adequately. So in addition to this, as I mentioned, so the portraits were extracted from these commendation kind of certificates, but there are also reprimands as well. So for example, Annett again has further gleaned and taken out this information from these particular files, and then she's put them in much more of this like democratized way of just viewing little snippets and sections of ways of understanding in ways of understanding just specific bits and phrases from each particular person, and also to further maintain anonymity by not just creating a full paragraph from one person's commendation. And we also have discipline and punishment. So there's also a section in the book where she does the same thing with particular disciplines, things that are, I mean, sometimes a little bit funny, you know, he is not a model for his soldiers, or he called his comrade germ. So things that are just a little bit, I mean, they're humanizing in that sense. And I think that's a really needed aspect to a project that deals with our very intense, deep archival structure. The next thing that's part of the book is entitled Escape Sketches. And so this takes up approximately, I think it takes approximately 20 to 25 pages in the book. But essentially what it is again, it was Annett as well as I believe a colleague going through the files and finding these particular documentation of escape attempts, where they took place, as well as providing context within where it happened in the wall, and the sketches that were involved in East German soldiers having to create a kind of drawing of how it happened as a way to avoid that in the past. So for example, this particular one that I chose to highlight, entitled The Abandoned Bride, basically depicts a guy that had been seeing a woman for a long period of time, but she also happened to have a house that was near the border. And so one day after he had moved in with her, 3 days later, she goes to sleep, she wakes up the next morning, and he's gone. He fled out, he exited out a window into West Berlin, never to be seen again. So it was kind of an interesting story and talks a lot about particular relationships and how they were affected. And you can see again, I've pointed out The Abandoned Bride is labeled here in one of the maps in the book, and then you can further direct it to a number that places it within the context of the wall. In addition to that, you can also see what I think is very fascinating. This is a close-up of the escape sketch, but further, in the book, there's abbreviations of the escape sketches where you can see, for example, WGs, which are circled here and here with the yellow, point to the WG here, which are the guards buildings. And then things like BP is an observation post. So they kind of highlight where this took place, what the routes were, where the guard houses were, etc., as a way to better understand how people had done these particular escape attempts. So I'm one slide away from being done, so I'll take questions, but there are two things I wanted to say. One is, as Bailey mentioned, I am the first artist in residence at the Venda Museum of the Cold War here in Los Angeles. I highly recommend visiting their website if you'd like to learn more information about East Germany. They obviously, the interior museum is closed, but they are now taking reservations on Fridays, 2:30 and 3:30 for their outdoor garden to view a number of works. Sorry, shameless self-promotion. I also have a work that's being presented there right now as well in the outdoor garden. So yeah, you should just check out the website and the museum, just because it's also an incredible space, and you can also view parts of the portions of the Berlin Wall in their garden space. And the last thing that I wanted to point out is, unfortunately, this book is out of print that I've been discussing, but you can, I actually purchased my version on Amazon. So if you search Amazon, eBay, or Abe Books, and I definitely recommend seeing a few different sellers, because prices range all the way from $50 to $150. So just to take a look, but the book is available. You just need to do a little bit of searching for that. And then on that note, I'm going to say thank you for this time and allowing me to present. And I look forward to taking some questions now from the audience.
Hi, Regina. I'm back. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Regina, thank you for that presentation. It was very thorough, detailed, and it was very interesting seeing being retraced through your process, outlining, Alfred and Annett's process. So that's very interesting. I have some comments here for you. Starting out, and everyone, again, please feel free to add some questions to the Q&A. It was a very critical subject matter, so just get comfortable and ask some questions if you have any. The first comment was from Douglas Bush, who says, "Thanks, Regina. I enjoyed the last talk and look forward to meeting you one day after these crazy times. Best, Doug."
Thank you, Doug. I look forward to meeting you too. Yeah, and we can always, since the garden is open at the Venda, I can also include my contact information as well in the chat if people want, if they want to get in touch or whatever. I love talking about everything East German and Cold War related. So thank you. And I welcome connecting with anybody too. Yeah, and I can even do that now. I can share in the chat. But yeah, and I can continue taking questions.
Absolutely. The first question, when you're ready, I'll let you put your information in the chat.
So I'm just writing my email address here. So feel free anytime to send me an email address. Love to hear from participants. So.
Wonderful. So our first question here is from Rob Aft. He said, "Why do you think there's so much interest in the art and culture of the post-World War II communist world?"
So I would say it depends. It depends on specifically what part of, because obviously post World War II is a very broad topic. If you're referring to specifically East Germany, for example, I think a lot of the interest is that, for example, Arwed and Annett, as I mentioned, didn't even receive this information until 1995. And when they accessed these this developed film, but film that had never been processed in the German Federal Archives, it had been recently declassified, but they said nobody was looking into it. So I think what is the interest is that as things become as things resurface and come back into the archives and are and renewed interest in scholarly approaches to things, because because all of these archives from the German state are now available to view. I think there's constantly new information that comes out even till today about some of the things that were happening in East Germany, especially because it was so secretive. And I think that's why there's a lot of interest, I would say, now in East Germany. In the Cold War in general, I would say, because I would say one of the things I've really enjoyed using, the phrase I've loved using for the last couple months, is the luxury of history. In the terms of the best way to understand current politics is to look back in time and to really reevaluate. And I think one of the things that's so important about this talk, even though it seems, one for the history books that is talked about a lot. It's still very important, particularly in this particular time period, and a cautionary tale of what ideological power looks like.
Absolutely.
I hope that answered the question too.
I'd say so. Yes. So the next one, this is from Michael Hawley. Hi, Michael. He said this might be a dumb question, but he said, why were the pictures of the soldiers in the text redacted, and who redacted them?
Yeah, no, and there are obviously never any dumb questions. So let me just go back really quickly. So the decision, my understanding was that it was definitely made to keep the soldiers anonymous. So it was out of protecting their identity, because some of these soldiers, as I mentioned, were 18 or 19 in 1966. So there are probably many of these people that are still alive and probably don't want to be identified as part of this history, I can imagine. But it might also have been part of the agreement between the German Federal Archives with Annett and Arwed using the material. That was one of the biggest reasons, was just to keep the anonymity of the soldiers, and that they were redacted by, they made the decision to redact them in this way. That is, the artist did it this way, as opposed to putting like a black bar or some other form.
And I actually have a question for you, Regina.
Yes.
To see if you can kind of go into more of your own personal insights in the project, based around the dualities of labor and image.
Yes.
Throughout the project, right? So the digital stitching and mapping, in juxtaposition with, the labor and construction and deconstruction of, locationally, but also of the actual archive.
Sure.
Yeah.
So could you just give me a little bit more specifics in terms of specifically what in the archive, or what aspects of the archive that you're thinking about? Is it mostly the panoramic images, or is it in terms of like the totality of the entire project?
I think, I'm interested in both aspects, but we did go over that briefly in the beginning, the stitching aspect of the panorama. Yeah. So the actual digital labor in that time historically, juxtaposing that with mapping it, and then to digital form.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's interesting about it is, as I mentioned, these were never intended, the intention for these photographs obviously was never to bring them together as one panorama. That was definitely an intention. That was something that also in the book, Arwed and Annett hem and hawed over a bit. They said it took a considerable amount of time to really decide whether or not they should show these photographs in this way, because obviously, as you mentioned, because digital stitching is a very new, it was at the time they couldn't even do this until 2011, because they didn't have the technology to do so. But I think ultimately what they were interested in more was the understanding of the kind of typology of the wall, instead of individual images that kind of ground you in a sense of like, okay, here's one, here's two. The idea is that when you see one of these panoramas, you're seeing everything all at the same time. And the kind of totality of that is much more powerful in terms of mapping the kind of presence in both the conceptual and physical sense, because it allows you to really be enveloped, even within the book as you're holding it, to really see the scale upon panorama that goes on for hundreds of pages, because we're talking about something like 160 kilometers, about 100 miles. So to see that in one book in this panoramic sequence is almost like seeing an unbroken line in some way.
Exactly. Absolutely. And also just throughout history in photography, the concepts of, the total view in the image form, right? Yeah. So the idea of the overall wide view of something and the truth behind that, even examination, right? Exactly. So yeah, I think that we can come to a close here, Regina. I think that was all of our questions, actually.
Great.
Your presentation was very thorough and sharp, so I'm sure that's why everyone's kind of like, okay, we're good. But again, thank you for being here with us, Regina, returning to talk with us and presenting this project to us. You couldn't have been a better person to present such a project. And yeah, do you have any closing words or anything that you'd like to say to the audience?
I just want to thank everybody for participating. And I know this is a really dense topic, but I think what's really important is just the idea that by artists interpreting archives in new ways and using the term, I'll use the term freeing up, which is what Annett and Arwed used, the idea that that artists can free up archival material is really important because it allows us to see history in much more nuanced ways, which is obviously incredibly important to examining the type of future that we want to have. So with that, I just wanted to add that. And yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. I knew you'd have a good closing. Okay, until next time, Regina.
Okay,
and
sounds good. Thanks,
all of you out
everybody.
there.
Okay, happy Friday. Thanks,
Yes.
everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.